everyone. Welcome to Designing Science, the IndieBio podcast. I'm Arvind Gupta, your host and the founder of IndieBio. I'm here to help share the secrets and tales from the frontiers of biotechnology. IndieBio enables the world's best scientists to build radically innovative companies. This podcast is for you. Welcome to another edition of Designing Science with IndieBio. I'm Arvind Gupta, the founder of IndieBio, and with me today, I'm thrilled to introduce Darrin Crisitello. He is an adjunct partner at IndieBio, and he also heads the global clinical team at Color Genomics. Darrin received his BS in biology and chemistry from Moravian College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and his MBA in UMass in pharma and biotech. So he started his career actually at BMS and then went over to the other side of the world in startup land, the actual opposite of large corporates. So I'm really thrilled to have Darrin. He's been incredible help at IndieBio. I've got to watch that firsthand in explaining how sales is critical to the success of young companies and how you grow those sales to over $1 billion in revenue, which Darrin has done in 3 companies in a row. So there's some incredible experience here, and I'm excited to dive into it. So welcome, Darrin.
Great, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So let's just go ahead and get started on in your upbringing. Did you know that you wanted to go more into sales and development, or was this something you found in college? How did you get to that calling?
Yeah, sure. So interesting question. I think I first started out, my first job, actually, I did chemical engineering. And so I was, did that job long enough to learn that I'm not a guy that should be in a lab all day long, and learned very quickly that that's probably not the right role for me. And so I transitioned really quickly to large pharma companies, first at Wyeth, then at Bristol Myers Squibb. And I was very fortunate at Bristol Myers Squibb to move up in the ranks and do really everything that's commercially related. So sales, marketing, operations, sales training, and I was really fortunate to be a part of that. And it was really interesting. My transition from Bristol Myers was really due in large part because I was running our HIV team, and we were supposed to deliver $320 million of revenue, and we delivered 380, and basically you got a tap on the shoulder and a thumbs up, hey, great job. And it became very clear to me that I was never going to change the overall trajectory at that company. And so it was really a hard thing to swallow. But then I made my transition over into startup, and again, I wanted to be, rather than a spoke in the wheel, really the wheel or the frame or the handlebars. So that was kind of my foray into startups, and I haven't looked back. I've been in really 7 different startups over the past probably 14 years.
Amazing. And so let's just go ahead and go with the one of the more recent ones, Natera.
Sure.
So when you joined Natera, tell us a little bit about Natera, and when you joined, where was the organization, and how did you help grow that into a multi-billion-dollar business?
Yeah, sure. So Natera is an interesting organization. They have they're strictly in women's health. At the time I was there, very early in the organization, small commercial team, handful of individuals, and it was really the opportunity to take that organization and launch a new product. The product was called Panorama. It was a non-invasive prenatal test, and so the question was, how do we move that to market? Happened to be one of the last entries to market, so people always think, hey, you're in a very saturated area. Is that going to be challenging? I think we had a little bit of a new technology than what was previously used, although it was still in the same space. And we were obviously very successful in moving that organization to be really the market leader in non-invasive prenatal. Some of the ways that I've done that is, when you have a company, especially in a crowded market, is how do you penetrate that market? And so a lot of the exercise was done around targeting, where are we going to focus our efforts, et cetera. But in addition to that, one of the ways we really got out in terms of grasping overall market share was the use of distribution partners. So contracted with various organizations to really bring in representatives that would sell the test on behalf of Natera. And so at one point we had a little bit over 500 partner representatives offering Panorama. The nice thing about that is obviously you have a reduction in margin when you utilize partners, because there's not as much of that to go around when you cut in other organizations, but you do get that reach and you do it at a low cost. And so we did that early on. We were able to get really widespread adoption and traction. And then once that occurs, then you start to determine at what point do we start to really ramp up our direct sales team. And so we started to do that. We started at 12, 24, 48, 96, 168. And I think the team is roughly around, let's call it 175 to 200 if you include international business as well. And so when you bring on your direct team, obviously you have a lot more control. You have the opportunity to gain a lot more margin because you're not obviously cutting in another organization. And the interesting thing is that when you have a partner that's, let's say you're getting a third of the margin that you would normally get, when you transition in terms of recapturing some of that market share, you really don't need to capture all of it, right? If I capture a third of the business, we're break even in terms of what that partner had. So it becomes a really interesting model, and it's a balance of, like every product, right? It's a balance between sales and sales volume and ASP, or average selling price, and margin. And once you can find whatever that seesaw threshold is, then you're able to kind of scale that and move forward.
Interesting. That's really cool. So what you're saying is you just scale and get out there as fast as possible to become a standard in the market, or a known standard in the market, trusted standard. And you'll give up margin by using distribution partners. But then as that standard becomes known and your name, the brand becomes strong, ramp up your direct consumers and then cancel your...
Correct.
Literally, you're canceling your distribution contracts.
Yeah, I think, so in many cases, those distribution partners will want to transition the product in-house anyway, right? They don't want to, always sell someone else's brand, and so they would want to move to some type of white label, and you have the option to either do that as an organization or allow them to transition somewhere else. But at that point, by utilizing more of a direct approach, you're able to then increase your margins, and you don't need as much volume. And I would say that is really important for established markets, because it's a land grab. When you have a little bit more of an unestablished market or unestablished product, then I think the strategy is slightly different, right? I don't know if I would try to find as many people go out there at once and try to scale that quickly. One of my quotes is like, scale never fixes problems, right? Scale makes them way worse and amplifies them. So, so I think that's just a balancing act of where you are in the life cycle of the product. Yeah,
no, that's really cool. And so, at Natera, it was a mature market, lots of prenatal tests that abounded. So how did you find the messaging, like how did you find that value proposition that really spoke to the customer? And was it hard to figure out who the customer was, given the payer dynamic with insurance and all that kind of stuff? Like, how do you navigate that, especially as founders that don't necessarily come from a commercial background?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things with any kind of approach for sales is finding the right audience. And so targeting is really important. And a lot of organizations, I think, they feel like they understand what the market is, but they might not do that, and they might not know that, and they go out and they try to execute anyway. I always find it's really valuable, invest a little bit of money in acquiring some data, and you try to look for what is the most solid data set that we can use to really help identify our customers. In non-invasive prenatal, it's challenging to use procedural codes to identify who's delivering the most babies, but pharma data is readily accessible, and it's usually very accurate. And so if you purchase data around, for example, prenatal vitamins, chances are if someone is prescribing a lot of prenatal vitamins, they probably have a lot of pregnant women. And so that's a nice analog to use from a targeting standpoint. And so that's what I did in Natera to try to help really pinpoint where we wanted to spend our time. Because early on, when you have a small team, you can't be everywhere. And I think that's another important aspect of this is you need to make sure that you're not just targeting the right customers, but you're targeting the right areas, right? You can't have 1, 2, 3 individuals trying to cover the entire U.S. It's not feasible. You're spending a lot of time in travel. It's just not efficient. So how do you maximize efficiency and maximize the right target audience?
Right, that's really neat. So how would you, I mean, you get a doctor that's prescribing a lot of prenatal vitamins and maybe another doctor that is giving you another set of data, let's just say, ordering certain types of, prenatal tests, things like that. How do you decide which ones to go for, right? How do you come up with that profiling strategy?
Sure, yeah, I think, well, it depends, depends a lot on, again, the major metropolitan areas that you want to target in. It also depends on the size of your team. And then, obviously you decile those physicians from, standard decile 10 down to, anyone below 6 usually you probably would not call on. And you basically start to tier the market very quickly on where you want to spend your time. Once you do that, you identify a target list, and really it's turning people loose at that point to go out and try to accomplish those sales there.
Gotcha. And what are some conversions that, since we're talking about sales,
Sure.
like what are some conversions at an early stage that you feel like says there's something here versus you're like, okay, something is really wrong? Like, how do you know if you're doing well or not?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think one of the areas I feel is really important whenever you start to launch any type of product is I would say you need to build a beachhead, right? A military term, and so a beachhead in this scenario would be, who are the experts in that field? So if you're working in a prenatal area, then you obviously should focus on individuals that are the experts in that field. If you're able to go to those experts in that field and you're starting to get traction, you've got pretty good indicators that you're on the right track. Because when you move through the next set of individuals that perhaps are not key opinion leaders, those folks are always going to say, hey, what is XYZ facility doing? Because they're the experts. And if the response is, they don't use us, or I'm not sure who they're using, that's a harder sell than to say, no, XYZ facility is using us in all of their facilities, et cetera. That other individual is like, great, I don't have to do the research here. Some other experts have already done it, and clearly it must be a good product. And so I think trying to leverage, no matter what the product is, whoever those key decision makers, key opinion leaders are in that space is really important.
Okay. Wow. All right. So you got to find those key opinion leaders, understand what their value proposition, really nail it, and then you can start to scale. Cool. And so how was that different than BMS, right? You were saying BMS.
Sure.
What was that difference like at Natera? And then from there, how did you carry those learnings on into color genomics?
Yeah. I think large pharma companies typically have not hundreds, thousands of individuals that are out trying to promote their products.
Right.
And so the targeting exercise is not quite that important because they're going to go to everyone anyway. Right. Those major metropolitan area selections are not quite that important because, again, they have people that cover the entire nation.
Interesting.
The messaging is not quite that important because they have multiple products. They already have an established brand name. All these pieces, I think, are very different than more of the startup world. And I often say, in many cases, some of those companies are successful despite themselves, right? They're not doing things as efficiently as possible, but they're a household name, right? Right. So that's very different than some of the things that we would look at from more of a startup front.
Yeah. So it really sounds like the startup, the big job of the startup is to establish credibility.
Correct.
In the mind of the customer, and once you have that trust and credibility, then it could go to the value proposition, how this is, maybe solving my life in a way that BMS isn't or Pfizer isn't, or something like that.
I mean, ultimately with any product, I always think about two things, right? The first is, why would someone want it? So is there clear data set, or is there recommendations or guidelines, or just an inherent desire from consumer or patient to want to get that? And then the second aspect is, who pays for it? Right. And if you can solve those two variables, you're in a good position. Yeah.
Let's jump over to who pays for it, because I think more than in any other field I've seen, who pays for it is really complex oftentimes in healthcare.
Yes,
right?
Unfortunately.
And patients rarely pay for much in healthcare. And so or they'll pay for parts of things, right? So like
Right.
how it all works is never as simple as going to a store and picking something off the shelf and going to the checkout. And so how do you figure that out? How do you understand that if you're joining a startup, about to do their sales, like how do you go about deciphering what the value proposition is, who the customer is, or the person that's getting the benefit, and who's paying, right?
Sure.
Like that relationship. How do you decipher that?
Yeah, well, it's really complex, and it depends upon the product and the company you're dealing with. But I mean, when I think about let's think about patients, what patients will pay for. Usually there's a threshold of obviously a dollar amount where individuals feel like that's a reasonable amount to spend, but it's also dependent upon what value they think they're getting out of the product or service. And so many cases, we might develop a great product or an assay or whatever it is internally, and we're like, hey, this is great because it addresses problem X.
Yeah.
And that from a patient standpoint, the patient's not concerned about problem X.
Right.
It was never an issue for them, so why is it an issue now? And so oftentimes I'll think about, well, what other aspects can we add to our offering that is going to resonate with that patient?
Right.
And so I'll use an example with non-invasive prenatal testing. So non-invasive prenatal testing, great offering determines if an unborn baby is at risk for trisomies 21, 18, and 13. And when providers would explain that to a pregnant woman, and they would say, hey, would you like to test? It's might be $300 or $400, and are you interested? And some folks would say, no, I'm good. I don't need to know that information. If you went through that same talk track and then said, well, we can also tell you the sex of the baby as early as 11 weeks, people, I'll take that. I'll pay for that.
Interesting.
Because I want to know what color to paint the nursery, or I want to be able to do a gender reveal party, or those types of things. And so clearly the value prop for the patient is not the same value prop that's for the provider or for the company. And so I think understanding what those values are for individuals are really, really important, because that's going to determine your uptake on sales in terms of payment. And that's for the patient. Obviously, there's a lot of other areas from a market access standpoint with payers, determining coverage rates and CPT codes and reimbursement for pharmaceuticals. All of those pieces are really variable. But in general, if you can get covered from one of those other areas and there's a small out-of-pocket cost for the patient, you generally tend to have better uptake.
Right. And then you went over to color genomics after Natera and decided to do it all again.
Yeah.
What are some of the lessons you took into color? And tell us a little bit about your color journey and some of the things that you expected to see and some of the things that you saw that you didn't expect to see.
Sure. Yeah, I think that the interesting piece about color is at every other company that I've worked at, the goal was always, what's the maximum amount we can charge insurance? What's the maximum amount we can get reimbursed, right? That's always the thought process for most diagnostic companies is how do we get paid appropriately. What really intrigued me about color is it was the direct opposite. It's really about what's the least amount we can charge and open up access for population health. And I think that really struck me because in many cases you'll have individuals that could likely benefit from the offering, but were priced out of it because of their payer group or just overall cost for them. In this scenario, I felt like it was really a kind of a paradigm shift for me, in that this is really more of a consumer cash offering type of product, which we altered obviously to be a more clinical product as well. Kind of when I made the transition. So that was one of the reasons why it was kind of exciting for me. I think the learnings are it is a more of a thought of as more of a consumer type product, which we had to change that dynamic. I think color is a clinical grade test, and it's one that we want to make sure that folks know. Just because it's an inexpensive test doesn't mean that it should be grouped into other consumer grade testing. It's just as high quality as any of the other tests from any other clinical laboratory that's out there. And so that was like a little bit of a piece that I was not expecting, which I think has been a little bit of an interesting dynamic.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it really strikes me that your insight when you went to color is that you're trying to charge as little as possible to broaden the market. I mean, that's a really neat way to think. What types of businesses do you think could benefit from that type of thinking? All, or is there a subset?
Well, I think it all depends upon what we can get the price point to for various businesses. I think consumers are obviously taking healthcare into their hands much more frequently than they have in the past. And so that's really important. I think as we move forward, that will continue to occur, and there'll be dramatic shifts in the way healthcare is looked at, in 5 years, 10 years from now than it is today. When you start to think about where healthcare costs really are allocated today, 90+% are allocated towards treatment of diseases and disorders, and very small amounts are towards prevention. And so if we could literally shift that paradigm and invest more resources in prevention and less on treatment, imagine not only the cost savings that would occur for various payers and patients, but also just way better patient outcomes. If we could shift the diagnosis of cancer one stage earlier, we would save ridiculous amounts of money and have way better outcomes.
Yeah.
And so that's really important.
And yet diagnostics is consistently has low multiples.
Yeah.
It really is a tragedy in that sense, that something that could provide so much savings and save so much unnecessary pain is not really incentivized by the public markets to be built. Why do you think that is? Is this a revenue growth thing? What is it that is holding diagnostics back?
I think that just the rate of reimbursement changes in many of the markets where diagnostics play is really the variable. You can have a test that's reimbursed at one rate this year, and in January of 2019 may have a 50% haircut on the reimbursement. And so I think the inherent variability of some of those tests, as well as the rate at which new tests are coming to market, put more risk on the diagnostic segment.
I see. It's harder to control one diagnostic indication, let's just say, even though you might control the technology.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a good point. And so, you mentioned healthcare is probably going to change in 5 to 10 years because of some of these technologies that are coming into consumers' hands. And at IndieBio, we're thinking a lot about that and seeing actually how home diagnostics or cheaper diagnostics is driving enterprise health to go to consumer health. What are some of the sort of material changes you think patients will see in their lives when they go to the hospital or don't go to the hospital in the next 5 to 10 years?
Sure. Yeah, well, I think getting medications obviously is becoming way easier. We know that you can do that through apps, through online ordering.
Right.
Obviously, there's these third-party physician networks that are becoming much more of a player. I think those are going to continue to move forward. I think diagnostic testing is obviously taking place more frequently in the home setting as well. Couple benefits out of that. Obviously, it's just overall more convenient, but I also think in many cases, especially around like the history that providers take when you go into an office, et cetera, when you're sitting in front of a provider during your 5-minute visit, and they ask you a little bit about family history, it's really hard to fill that out and come up with the right information, because you're kind of on the spot and you might not remember everything, versus when we place all of those things in more of the home setting, people are much more comfortable. They can take more time to fill out their information, give much more accurate results, which in turn helps the providers obviously designate the right medications or treatment for them. And so I think as that starts to evolve when we move forward, we are going to have better outcomes. We're going to have lower costs. And it's kind of moving us to the future there in overall healthcare.
Yeah, that's amazing. I certainly hope so. I think it will reduce the load overall on the healthcare system, and also empower people to take their own health into their own hands, where it ultimately rests. That's great. And so, where do you see, in terms of sales, is there like anything that you see that first-time entrepreneurs or scientists are always making mistakes on, or like, what are some tips that you have that can transform someone's sales tomorrow?
Sure. I think the number one piece that I always talk about is it's very easy to take on a lot of different items where you let certain pieces that if you followed up on them more quickly, they would have kept moving forward. But because maybe there's increased time between follow-ups, it just tends to drown out and increase the overall deal cycle. And so I think the number one thing I tell people is, pick, a number of things that you're going to be working on, and make sure you're, aggressively following up on those and pushing them forward. And if you get to a point where it's not going to move forward any longer, that's okay. Kill it quick and move on, but replace it with another one in the pipeline. I think if we're able to execute on those quickly, that tends to, success breeds success, and you can continue to move forward.
Amazing. So simply following up fast. Is like the number one thing. And so, I mean, how fast? Is it 5 minutes, half an hour, a day? Like what constitutes, is there such thing as too eager?
Sure.
Right? Because I think a lot of people worry about that. You know?
I get asked that a lot, and hey, I haven't spoke to someone in a couple weeks, when should I get back with them? And so I think it depends on where you are in the cycle. Early on, I mean, if it's every, once a week to try to get some early traction. Once you engage with someone, I always try to make it a habit to try to at least have connection with them, a few times per week, even if it's not
every other day.
Even if it's not super relevant, right? It's like, oh, hey, by the way, I'm going to send you over some additional information on X, Y, and Z. We talked about this the other day. When's a good time for us to follow up to walk through the term sheet, or what? Those types of things I think are important. And I think that's like one of the biggest pieces is just making sure, especially with new founders and kind of folks from a scientific background that perhaps aren't used to doing that, is probably the biggest learning for them. Yeah,
and the fact that they could do it, I think that's another thing that we see at IndieBio that's interesting is a lot of scientists come in that have, they've never started a company before, and they're scientists, but they now have to do sales. They have to actually sell, right? And so them realizing that sales is a skill, just like pipetting, is I think one of the more fun things to watch on people's faces. I can only imagine you've seen that countless times in your career. What are some ways just to really realize that you could do that? Is there like something you could watch? Is there like besides just doing it, like is there a way to do it without having to have started a company to realize it?
I mean, I think the easiest way is something I just like to talk to folks about, and they're like, hey, I'm not good at sales, or I haven't done sales.
Right.
And I'm like, that's not true. You do sales all the time. I'm like, let's just compare like something you would normally do to sales. And I use this example. I'm like, let's say you're planning a party. What's the first thing you do when you plan a party? And someone's like, well, I got to determine who I need to invite. I'm like, okay, that's targeting. Right?
Okay.
So it's like sales. You're going to target, you're going to identify who you want to invite and who you're going to spend time with. And then once you identify, you have a list of people. And okay, that's great. That's the first part of what you would do in sales. I'm like, what do you do next? They're like, well, I got to tell people about it, where it is, and location. I'm like, okay, that's your pitch deck. Right? That's your message, and you're going to pull that together, and you're going to send that out to folks. And I'm like, what's going to happen next? We're like, well, I got to know. I got to know if they're going to come or not. I'm like, okay, that's closing. Like, hey, will you come? Right? Are you going to come to my party? It's like we're not splitting the atom here. Like, I mean,
it's
pretty simple when you actually kind of drill down as the kind of the lowest common denominator. And I think when you explain that to folks, they're like, hey, you know what? You're right. I do this. I do this on a daily basis. I can do it. And then we start to incorporate. Okay, let me help you. What are some of the different things around your pitch deck which are important? Right. What is closing? A lot of people are really uncomfortable asking for anything, right? And I always say closing is important. You should always be asking for something, right? Whether that's, hey, well, when should I expect the contract back, or, can we have a follow-up meeting? Something as small as, hey, can we have a follow-up meeting next week? That's closing, right? So always asking for something.
Yeah. So every interaction ends with a thing to close.
Correct.
I really like that.
Yeah.
That's great, and that's the engine of momentum.
And then that way you can follow up in a few more days and say, hey, I sent you a message on this, haven't heard back from you, or here's some additional information that might help, schedule that, or I have availability on these dates. Just little things to kind of keep that whole, discussion, ongoing.
And what happens when someone says no?
Yeah. So I think, I would say no never, no means not now.
Right.
Right. So it's like, okay, so if this isn't a great time for you, that's okay. I always try to say, okay, well, help me understand, what were some of the reasons for that? Because I think that also helps us self-reflect on, hey, was it the way we presented something? Was it the materials? We didn't have enough content. We didn't convince them on the data. Whatever it is, that can kind of help us for future discussions. And then I would always say, you follow up, you put those on individuals on a follow-up list, right? Maybe you follow up with them in a few months. Something new comes out. Hey, I'm not sure if you saw a new article that just was released in New England Journal of Medicine or Fortune or whatever it is. There's ways to continue to keep them involved.
Yeah, I love that way of thinking, right? Like, yes, it's not only a learning opportunity, but they can be converted later.
Sure.
It's a great way to think. And so, when someone says no, do you structure a way to take that back into your value proposition and understanding kind of the offering and maybe modify the product, or like how malleable is that process for you?
Yeah, I think it depends on how frequently you hear the same no.
Okay.
Right? If I hear no and it's in 10 different areas, well, that could be the needs of the customer. If I hear no and it's because of one specific area, then that's not the needs of the customer. That's a product issue.
Right.
And then at which point we would attempt to make changes there.
Very cool. And so at the very earliest stages of a company, would you want to script that sale so that way you might lead to the same types of reactions? I mean, if that's even at all possible,
Sure.
I don't even know, but just brainstorming here, like if that feedback loop is almost as important as the sale, to find product market fit, are you really kind of like trying to have the same conversation every time to look for those patterns?
Ideally, you would love to do that. I think it's challenging because not every conversation can go that way. But I think the way I try to structure it is, what are the 3 to 5 most important bullet points that we would want to convey on every discussion? And they might come across a little differently, but at the end, if we've covered those, then we get as close to that as we can. Now, kind of a learning from pharma. Pharma does very strict messaging, where their messaging is almost, identical from sales rep to sales rep. It's hard to do that, but that's the goal. They try to do that for a number of reasons: compliance, messaging, et cetera. And so if you can do that, I think you're able to get more structured feedback. I always find that feedback, though, like if I'm rolling out messaging in the field and we're getting feedback, we're getting feedback too late in the process, right? We should have done market research earlier before we unleashed the scale on and trying to go after that market. And so I would say that's targeting. Then you're doing your market research to help craft your message. Once you have that, you go forward. Hopefully, you don't have to make too many dramatic changes at that point.
Right. And so you've trained a lot of salespeople, right?
Sure.
I mean, you've helped build more than 3 sales organizations, 6 or 7. If I was to join your sales organization, right, what would be the first thing you made me do?
Yeah, so I think first thing is we want to obviously give a baseline of product knowledge. I think I use the approach that if you can run a marathon, you can run a 5K. So we want to give you everything.
Yeah.
We don't expect you to use everything when you're out in the field. You might need to just use little snippets, but if you have it all, you'll be more prepared. I think that's important. But this is interesting. Someone used to say to me, like, if you had 3 things that, what do you think are the most important of these 3 things? Product knowledge, relationships, or selling skills. And if you talk to people about that, a lot of folks would say, well, product knowledge is really important. You need to be an expert. And there's no right or wrong answer here. But the piece for me is always selling skills, because I might not know much about that glass, but I could probably sell it, right? Like, and so like that's the piece that if you're trying to get up as quickly as possible,
right?
That's the piece that I think is probably the most important. But in healthcare, we have a little bit more responsibility to providers and patients to make sure that our individuals are not just going out and selling something for the sake of selling it. We want to make sure that they have that baseline knowledge.
That's right. And so, a lot of times the first sales hire at a startup is an important one, because you're putting a lot of responsibility on that individual to help you get to the next funding round and get the traction you need. And yet the CEO or the founders might not have that type of background. So how could they know what are some ways they can understand if this person they're interviewing is a good salesperson?
Yeah, I mean, so I always kind of equate back to past performance is a good indication of future results. And so
Sure.
I think if you have someone that's been successful on multiple occasions, that's obviously a really good indicator. I think the other piece is how passionate is that individual for your particular product or service, because I find that if you're not passionate about whatever it is you're selling, it's very easy for people to see right through that. And
Right.
if you're not excited about your product, how the hell can someone else be,
Sure.
right? So I think that's that's an important aspect. It is a challenge though for early founders, because I also think I hear people thinking about, hey, I need to hire a head of sales or a head of marketing or whatever that may be. And when in reality, you don't need a head of, you need someone that can execute at that level. So really, I think finding an individual that is more tactical, that can execute on the options that you need, is really important. You can hire a sales leader later, but in most cases, sales leaders are not the ones that are out there really driving sales. They're the ones helping orchestrate the strategy around that.
Right.
So those are kind of two separations.
Interesting. And so, when you're bringing someone on, is there any typical ranges of commission? Like how again, for these founders and salespeople are very different people than
Sure.
oftentimes these scientists and different motivations. So can you suggest any range, like what's the best way to get someone that's out of your league as a founder, that's passionate about what you're doing, but gets them to monetarily still be compensated for their skill set?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting challenge, because certain markets have set the bar really high, and so I always think people should be rewarded for driving sales.
Yeah.
So a large percentage of their compensation should be tied to
Absolutely.
performance, which is important. I also think. Look, salespeople are motivated by a number of things. Obviously, commission is one of them. Recognition's another one. Just public recognition and just overall, motivation. I think are pieces that a lot of folks don't think of, and certainly, founders are very busy, and they might not spend as much time with those individuals because they think, hey, I hired someone that's going to know how to do it. I'm just going to let them go run with it. My suggestion there would be to make sure that they spend the time with those individuals, build that relationship, which is so important as you start to scale any company. Because one of the things that's really important is, as you start to hire individuals, you can hire a whole team of people and tell them to go out and do their work. And they'll be successful, some of them, but you're still going to lose folks due to, they're not happy at their role,
Sure.
or they don't spend enough time, they haven't been motivated enough. But I always feel like if I build enough of a bond and relationship with people that work with me, they won't want to leave, right?
Right.
They don't want to let you down, and they'll run through walls for you. And if you provide that same level of respect back, I think you can really increase the output of those individuals. And
Right.
we've talked about this before. People say all the time, "Hey, you don't have to love the people you work with; you just have to work with them." And I'm like, that's bullshit.
Yeah.
Like,
That's
if you have a team that really is loves one another and wants to support one another, and will pick up the pieces if somebody's down, because that happens, right? It's not all peaches and cream when you're out trying to drive sales. When you have that level of support amongst the team, you can really move mountains. So it's really important.
Yeah, I agree with that. It also makes it just so much more fun. Startups and life itself is already hard enough,
Yeah.
right? You don't need to come to work and have a battle there too, right?
Totally.
So finally, just as you've looked at the investing side as well as an angel, are there commonalities between sales as a function of selling product for a company, but
Sure.
also raising money?
Yeah.
Do you think, are there certain skill sets that the CEO can draw from when they're out pitching? And what do you advise the founders that you're investing in around raising more money?
Yeah, I think the one piece that comes up for me a lot is, just because we can do something in the lab or making an assay, et cetera, doesn't mean that we should, right? And oftentimes I'll hear someone say, hey, we've done this and it's incredible. And it really is incredible. But it's incredible for a really small percentage of the market. Right. And therefore, from a monetization standpoint, we can't sell it as effectively as we would like. So I think, understanding the balance between developing a really novel product with also the opportunities of the market are really important. I use the phrase all the time. You need to meet people where they are today.
Right.
Initially, right? We'll drag them to where we want them to be, but you need to meet them where they are today in order to kind of have a successful company, because it's really hard to go from A to Z in a single step.
Yeah. Cool. Well, we're running out of time, so one last question. I mean,
Sure.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of the future of the sales organization. So, as online tools, in healthcare, it's less common to use social media and things like that
Sure.
to sell. It's absolutely standard now in consumer products, and as a matter of fact, now the latest rage is direct to consumer, for regular consumer products. How do you see social media and things like that fitting into healthcare sales, or even deeper products within the healthcare system, or do you think that's just always going to be too far?
So it's a great question. I think, and experiencing it firsthand at Color, right? We deal with this all the time.
That's right.
Obviously very, very active on the social side.
Yeah, I think I've gotten Instagram posts about Color. So, yes.
But from a provider standpoint and from a hospital standpoint, that's not what moves them, right? It's much more data driven. And so I think there's still some time where you'll still need boots on the ground to really execute and to bring new products and services to that segment. The goal would be, and however long it takes, is that we start to move to more of like a health system type approach where things are pushed down from those health systems versus an independent provider or hospital. Obviously large health systems are gobbling up hospitals and physician practices by the day, and so I think eventually we'll get there. I don't believe that is a place where we're at today, and we still do need a lot of kind of individual visits and more of a kind of a direct approach to dealing with some of those customers. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it really, a defining part of IndieBio is that we say, it's a slogan internally, right? Sales solves everything, right? You have a problem raising money, go sell something, right? You have a problem, in the lab, go sell something.
Sure.
Sales will solve everything because it means that there's actual traction and value being created, and it's proof of that, right? As it's the business experiment, literally, that shows that your product can actually go somewhere, as opposed to just the lab experiment that proves that your product can deliver on an assay or a diagnostic or whatever. And so translating that is always, I think, one of the hardest parts and one of the biggest challenges for early stage founders. So I really appreciate you coming in and helping our audience understand how they might apply some of these things and insights to their own businesses. So thank you so much, Darrin, for joining us on the show.
Excellent. Thanks, Arvind. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.